Hello everybody! So, Monster Hunter 3U. It's one of the games I still really like and consistently play. Monster Hunter is just my favorite franchise, but 3U is the one I go back to in terms of the furthest back game, most consistently. I have played some Freedom Unite, but unfortunately, my file on my PlayStation Vita died, so can't go back to that. Instead, let's take a look at 3U. Which is great, because the third generation is honestly a really cool and unique generation in of itself. And one of the things I wanted to do was take a look at the monsters, specifically in low rank. I am the low rank hunter, and low rank is where I tend to do my hunts the most. High rank, I specialize in only specific equipment and against certain monsters. In low rank, I go against every single monster with every single weapon just to get a good feel of it all, and I just really enjoy it. I use it as my relaxing time. It's a great way to just play the game as if it was an arcade style game. So today, we're gonna rank the monsters found in Monster Hunter 3U's low rank, from easiest to hardest, and I should note these are all going to be monsters found within the village quests. We won't be looking at hub, though I'm pretty sure in terms of the tavern, there aren't very many monsters that are exclusive to it in terms of the low rank, so, well, pretty good there. A few rules of how I'm going to go about this, because I hunted every single monster with the same basic principle. Rule number 1 is that the armor I'm going to be wearing has to be of a similar rarity to the monster itself. So, for example, Lagombi gives off rarity 2 armor, so the armor I'd be wearing against it would also be rarity 2, only upgraded as high as you can in terms of low rank upgrades, so armor spheres and armor sphere pluses only. Secondly, the equipment also has to be weak to a monster's element, so Lagombi is another good example. If it has ice, then the armor I wear has to be weak to ice, to kind of give the monster still a bit of an advantage. Also, the armor cannot create any immunities to any specific status. I cannot be immune to poison, I cannot be immune to paralysis, and I cannot be immune to sleep, specifically if the monsters end up using these in their attacks. Second rule, weapons are also going to be only raw damage. No elemental weapons and no status weapons. You will see in a few clips when I use switch axes that my raw damage switch axes, when transitioned to sword mode, have status effects, so I ended up not using sword mode with those weapons and only stuck with the axe mode. I want to also add that when it comes to the weapons I'm using against monsters, they're all also low rank weapons, only upgraded as high as you can with low rank materials, similar to armor. I will not be using any bonus meals before every hunt. The only buffs I give myself are maybe a Mega Nutrient and a Demon Drug for higher tier monsters. Otherwise, I go in completely blank and only use well done steaks or maybe some rations to boost up my stamina. And lastly, a rule I might change for future videos, like the Monster Hunter Generations one and the Monster Hunter World one, though I'm not 100% certain yet. I guess I'll get some feedback from you guys on this, but I hunted these monsters solo with none of the Cha-Cha or Kayamba's help. It was simply hunter versus monster, no assistance, which did prolong a few hunts, but that's kind of the point. I wanted to test these monsters all on their own with not too much extra support. Alright, with that being said, let's begin this video, and as a side note, this is unscripted, so I apologize if it isn't the most streamlined thing. Here we go! Okay, so at the absolute bottom of my list, we have Arzuros, the lovable blue bear. What puts Arzuros so low, all the way at the bottom, is it's kind of pathetic. It has some decent attacks. If you're in the right situation, or I guess in the wrong situation, it certainly can do damage. He can swing his arms around quite heavily, and they can throw you across the map, kind of. He does have moves that can do damage. The problem with Arzuros isn't that it doesn't have capable attacks, it's that it has an incredibly small amount of health. Like, ridiculously so. I have yet to hunt Arzuros in low rank where it even lasts 2 minutes. It's ridiculously weak. It's so pathetic. I get this when it comes to the Great Jaggi, which is the most earliest of monsters, but Arzuros is not. It's not the first monster you hunt, but it has just a pitiful health pool. And on top of that, it's actually way easier to hit, so it's a great monster to practice weapons on, but it's nothing in terms of being a threat unless you have absolutely nothing in terms of armor and your weapons are the absolute weakest. It's a pathetic monster. I still like it. I guess I should say it's more of it's sad in 3U just how easily you can beat up this monster. And now we move on to who is the first large monster you hunt in the game, the Great Jaggi, which is to be expected. Like I said, it's the very first large monster you hunt. It's supposed to be simple, it's supposed to be weak, it's supposed to be something you can learn pretty effectively off of, and it does that well. It's just not really much of a challenge. The only thing that gives the Great Jaggi any type of advantage over Arzros in this case is, again, it's a little bit tougher to hit, and I'd say it moves around quicker too. This can only be a challenge for, say, some slower or heavier weapons such as greatsword or hammer, but either way, you're not going to really encounter anything in terms of difficulty. Great Jaggi, pretty easy. So rather quickly into this whole series, we have the next of the Fanged Beast trio, Lagombi. Now yes, Lagombi is a very adorable sliding rabbit, but the thing is, despite when you have the chance to hunt it in the game, it's incredibly easy. Maybe it's just because I've been hunting Lagombi for a long time. I've been hunting it in 3U, 4U, Gen U, hunted this monster quite a bit. So I've become incredibly familiar with its moves, but I really don't think its moves are all that threatening or damaging. Sure, Lagombi can hit you with some ice balls or will throw them at you, but they're incredibly easy to dodge, especially with how small they are. And it does have this butt landing move that is there. The thing that makes Lagombi more of a threat is its sliding, and that sliding certainly keeps it very active and gives it a lot of moving opportunities. It can really position itself out of your combos, and that can get really frustrating, and that side slide has a good chance of knocking you out or out of the way. But other than that, most of its moves are pretty predictable. And depending on what weapon you're using against Lagombi, those slides end up giving you more of an opportunity if you guard well with a lance or gun lance, or if you're going duels and just kind of demon dash through them. Okay, it's our first Leviathan and underwater monster, or at least a monster you can hunt that sometimes ends up being underwater. And of course, this is the one I think to be the easiest of our three main aquatic monsters, that being the Royal Ludroth. Our spongy-maned big boy here really only has one method of attacking, and that's usually charging. Sure, it'll spit some water at you from time to time, and it does have this tantrum attack where it goes charging and spitting water at the same time, so that's something interesting. But it's never really that much of a damage-inflicting move, and because it doesn't reposition itself when charging, it's pretty easy to dodge. When underwater, it's a little different. The monster will do some charging as well, and it definitely has these swipe moves that can kind of be disorienting, mostly just because underwater combat is a little bit clunky. It's not awful, but it takes some time to get used to. However, I really wouldn't say that Royal Ludroth is a major threat when underwater. Strangely, the thing that makes the Royal Ludroth the most annoying for me to hunt is its roll. For whatever reason, that roll has a really good chance of catching me off guard, or he uses it when I least suspect it. It's not a difficult move to dodge, it's just usually it happens when I'm mid-combo or I'm already charging up a really big attack. It doesn't do a lot of damage, thankfully, and there are some moments when Royal Ludroth will spam this, which can get annoying, but otherwise we're still on the easy side of hunts. So some people might find it a little surprising that I put the other members of the Jaggi trio above some larger monsters. And to start off with, we're going to be looking at the Great Baggi, and the reason for why I think the Great Baggi is more threatening or a greater challenge in comparison to Lagombi and Royal Ludroth mostly has to do with its status-inflicting sleep. For the most part, the Great Baggi itself isn't something too difficult to hunt. It has the same kind of moves that the Great Jaggi has, so as long as you know those, you're in the safe zone. They don't inflict too much damage, and really the hardest part can be sometimes just hitting the monster because it's not a very large monster. However, that sleep really does change things up here in two different ways. One is that the Great Baggi tends to not hunt alone. You'll often find little baggies hanging around it too, and they like to spit sleep balls just as much as the Great Baggi, if not more. So when you're focused on the Great Baggi, one of them can kind of come up behind you and hit you with the sleep status. Not the most fun thing to deal with, especially since that leaves you pretty vulnerable to other attacks. Which really, just because the Great Baggi has this status is what puts it a little bit higher for me. Though, the easiest way to get rid of the sleep status if you didn't bring any items or have any armor to make you immune to it is to let the Baggi hit you. It doesn't do too much damage and then you're fully recovered from the sleep. The most interesting thing for me when I was hunting the Great Baggi was A, it took a little bit longer to hunt than I realized it would, and B, that the spitball it uses can actually go past some shields. It has just enough arc where if you're in the wrong position, even when guarding, you're gonna get hit by it from behind, which is surprisingly effective. So yeah, the Great Baggi is where I'd say we start getting monsters that are a bit more threatening. Moving on, and concluding the Jaggi trio, we have my personal favorite, the Great Wroggi. Much like the Great Baggi, it has a similar attack style to that of the Great Jaggi, so there's nothing really new there to talk about. The only thing that's different is its spit, which is poison. In fact, it's a poisonous gas. A similar thing applies here with the Great Baggi. The smaller Wroggis will also spit out poisonous gas, and they can be annoying. They also seem to like to do this tail swipe the most that I've noticed, which has a good chance of just like catching you off guard and doing a little chip damage when you're trying to get ready for a combo or something. While that bulbous frog sack of a mouth might be a bit disgusting on the Great Wroggi, the poisonous gas it emits is surprisingly effective. Poison in of itself is not the most fun status to deal with, and I think a lot of people tend to not enjoy poison, especially in higher ranks when there's much deadlier versions of poison. But what makes this poison a little bit more annoying is that the poisonous gas lingers in the air and spot for a while. It's not just a hard drop or like a hard hit. It just stays there and you have to avoid that area for a bit, which means you have to be a lot more mindful of your surroundings when hunting the Great Wroggi. It's not a super hard monster and it goes down quite quickly, but that poison is something to keep an eye out for. Okay, up next we have the mud boy himself, the brute wyvern Barroth. First off, Barroth looks really cool and it's a fun monster to hunt, but this one is definitely one of the first hurdles, I would say, in the game. There are a few things that make Barroth stand out a bit differently compared to other monsters. First off, its elemental resistances. Depending on whether or not it has mud on the monster, this will change what its weaknesses are or what its resistances are. So if you're using certain elemental weapons, this can be a bit more cumbersome. However, I don't think the differences are that drastic, so it's not a huge deal. Secondly, this is the first really large monster that is capable of hitting you with its tail swipe the most effectively, compared to previous monsters. On top of that, it's got some harder skin, so early on in the game, some parts of the Barroth are pretty resistant. Its head kind of lingers down a bit, so if you hit it with a longsword and you don't have something like Mind's Eye, you tend to bounce off, which leaves you completely vulnerable to other hits, and when Barroth charges, it's definitely going to do a significant amount of damage. Even when charging, this monster has the ability to kind of turn itself and position itself a bit better to try to come right at you, so it's not the easiest thing to dodge. It's still pretty dodgeable, but has a better chance of hitting you than any other monster prior on this list so far. Last thing of note is that when Barroth is covered in mud, he will also shake that mud off, and if it happens to land on you, then you kind of become a bit inactive. You can move around, but you can't really hit, and you have to use a certain item to recover this status, or have a partner hit you. It's a little annoying, but nothing awful. If you can position yourself just right underneath Barroth, you're definitely going to be in the safest area there, but it moves around a lot, so you can't just take advantage of that all the time. The last thing I want to note here is that the footage I captured for hunting Barroth was the first time I ever did so with a hunting horn, and while I'm not really great with hunting horn yet, I think it's actually super fun and it really shows off just how useful this weapon is. It was a genuinely great hunt. So, up next we have Nibelsnarf, and Nibelsnarf is kind of in a similar situation as Lagombi for me, except a bit tougher. I've hunted a fair amount of Nibelsnarf at this point, not as many as Lagombi, but when I was first ever hunting Nibelsnarf, I did find it to be a bit difficult. In particular, its sand spray move it does with its gills when it slams its head, for whatever reason that move tend to get me the most. Nowadays, I'm more knowledgeable about the monster, and as such know that it's better to position yourself at the side of the monster's head rather than at its back, or straight up in front of it. This is because being at its side gives you the most opportunity to dodge basically every single attack it has, such as its mega sand spray, when it chomps down with that massive jaw of it, or even when it gets ready to do a charge. Sure, Nibelsnarf is a monster that likes to hide in the sand a lot, and this can be annoying because it means you can't hit it as often as you would like to. However, to counter this, Nibelsnarf surprisingly has a few ways to exploit its moves, or just the monster in of itself. First of all, when charging, because Nibelsnarf leaves its mouth wide open if you happen to place a barrel bomb along its path, it will swallow the bomb, and eventually it explodes within the monster, leaving it very open and vulnerable to combos, discharges, and just more attacks. I personally tried to steer away from doing this when it came to my hunts, like using sonic bombs and maybe flash bombs that really give you an extra edge against monsters, which is necessary and certainly helpful, but I tried to steer away from that just to kind of see how difficult monsters were in on themselves. Nibelsnarf kinda ends up bucking the trend in this way because in certain moments, when you do enough damage to Nibelsnarf or get it caught within the sand itself, since it sticks in the sand so much, there is an opportunity when you can fish the monster literally right out, and you don't need to have any special items on hand to do so. Doing this ends up leaving Nibelsnarf even more vulnerable to attacks, so it's not that difficult of a monster. So despite its goofy name, Nibelsnarf is one of those monsters that can put up a pretty decent challenge. I've certainly gotten more used to it, and I can see why some people might find it annoying because it is one of those sand monsters that likes to bury itself and can be difficult to keep up with. Depending on a person's point of view, this also might be a bit of a shocker to see this high up on the list. An incredibly early monster, we have the Qurupeco. Let's get a few things out of the way here first. The Qurupeco, despite being a flying bird, doesn't really stay in the air too often, and even when it is in the air, it's very much within hitting range for almost any weapon. Secondly, the monster doesn't do a whole great amount of damage, it's pretty easy to hit, and in the earlier ranks, unless you're doing like certain quests, when it does summon other monsters, it tends to only be a great Jaggi, which can be a little difficult, but nothing too unmanageable. The things that keeps Qurupeco so high is for a couple of reasons. One of those would be the first time I ever hunted Qurupeco in 3U. To provide some context, Qurupeco is a fire-based monster, and a lot of the early armor sets you get are going to be weak to fire. On top of that, your weapons are still within yellow sharpness and don't do the greatest amount of damage. This is a problem because Qurupeco's main hitting spots are also very tough and often result in your weapons bouncing off the monster, leaving you fairly vulnerable. A combination of these things results in Qurupeco genuinely being one of the more difficult monsters you hunt very early on in the game, to the point where it could be considered one of the first roadblocks. What also ends up putting Qurupeco up this high on my list is that I think conceptually, and just in general, the monster just has a lot more going for it than some of the earlier monsters. For example, depending on what weapon you're using, it can still be a bit difficult to keep your sharpness up when dealing with Qurupeco. On top of that, Qurupeco is basically a living hunting horn. It's capable of giving itself multiple buffs, things like boosting its attack, maybe some defense, and annoyingly enough can even heal itself, though I don't think it does a significant amount of health. Still, that's a shocking thing to see. And as I alluded to before, one of the things that can make Qurupeco genuinely annoying is its cry. Qurupeco has the ability to mimic other monster cries, allowing it to summon them into hunts. And in some quests, when it does this, it will summon greater monsters such as a Rathian, who can definitely put up an extra challenge when dealing with the monster. I think Qurupeco is a really cool looking bird and definitely one of the more unique creatures in the series. And to me, I really haven't faced a monster so early on in a game that left quite the same impression. Monsters like Ceadeus and 4U had a fair hunt and some cool gimmicks to it, but nothing that really made me have to bring in a whole bunch of whetstones just to deal with the next monster. So for that, Qurupeco definitely deserves some respect, as being a good challenge pretty early on. Alright, this is it. This is the turning point. Any monster beyond here isn't particularly easy. They're all adequately tough and will give you a proper fight. And to kick ourselves off into this tier, we have one of my absolute favorite monsters and my number one favorite monster from the first generation, Rathian. I know that might be kind of weird, but she is genuinely my favorite mid-tier monster. I think she is the perfect hunt. She's both adequately tough, but never too challenging, and always has some type of ability to be hit by. For example, when she's in the air, you're always still capable of hitting her tail, and sometimes that can result in tail cuts and just staggering out of the air, which is very nice. All her moves have really good tells, and you have a great opportunity to dodge every single one of them, but will be punished quite severely if you aren't reading them well. I know there are plenty of people that hate it when she does her triple lap attack, which has been known to cause stun effects quite often, and I get it. It is annoying. What I find surprising about Rathian is that she's most known for her poison inflicting, even though she only has one attack that does poison damage, and trust me, it's a damaging move. It has a very iconic tell, but that move has been known to really mess up hunters. It kinda ends up adding just salt to the wound. It does a significant amount of damage and also ends up poisoning you, leaving you with some residual damage. But it's her only poison attack. Instead, she has a lot more fire-based attacks, like shooting off multiple fireballs and being able to do these combustion flames. Because I tend to main Sword and Shield the most, particularly in the 3rd generation, I can say that my area of dealing with Rathian might not be the norm or best for other weapons, but I tend to find hiding behind her hind legs or being right up in her face to genuinely be some of the best areas to stay to avoid most of her attacks. Yeah, don't be right in front of her because that's not smart, but being at the side of her head, much like with Nibelsnarf, is certainly effective. Rathian is awesome, she is the queen of poison, she is one of the coolest monsters in the series, and I think she makes for a great midpoint monster. Finishing off the Fanged Beast trio, we have ourselves Volvidon, who isn't tough because he does a lot of damage, is tough because he has a fair amount of great status effects. There are 3 main things that Volvidon can do to you. The most manageable of these, for me anyway, is its tremor creating. Because Volvidon is this armadillo-like creature that's basically a living bowling ball, it can jump up in the air and cause these little tremors when bouncing around. And this just leaves you vulnerable for a little bit. Most of the time you're just missing out on opportunities to hit the monster if it affects you versus being open to damage. To be fair, it can be kind of annoying when it rolls around a lot. This roundness to the monster gives it a lot of mobility and can even help it reposition itself quite nicely. No, there are 2 things I would say that make Volvidon something more challenging than the other 2 fanged beasts, and even compared to certain monsters in general. First off is its paralysis. The paralysis breath, while dodgeable, is definitely the least fun thing to deal with. Unless you have an immunity to the status, you're just gonna get hit, and trust me, Volvidon actually uses this to its advantage, by either rolling right into you or stomping on you, and the stomp is definitely the more dangerous move. When hunting it for this video, I surprisingly learned that the tongue is one of the most annoying things this monster has on display. It likes to use its tongue to pull you in for attacks, and it ends up leaving you completely open to any other move the Volvidon has, particularly its paralysis spit. So that'd be why I say its paralysis is more effective than usual for other monsters that I hunt that tend to use that status. One of the more obnoxious things to deal with when it comes to Volvidon is its gas. If you are anywhere near the monster when it lets off this gas, it does only a little damage, but it leaves you with a status that prevents you from being able to heal. Not being able to heal means that if it follows things up with paralysis, or some tremors, or just keeps hitting you with its tongue, results in a lot of stacked damage that can cart you. While I don't hate Volvidon, and I don't think it's the most difficult hunt, it does lean more on the annoying side for me, and as such, I don't like the monster a whole lot. It's got some cool equipment, but Volvidon, when it comes to hunting, not the most fun. Ugh, it's a stupid chin monster. Okay, so yes, here we are finally hitting the top 10. And at number 10, we have Uragaan. I don't think this monster is particularly bad. It's an okay monster in terms of its design. It has some cool weapons and some cool armor, but the hunt is definitely one of my least favorites. Okay, so the Great Stone Chin Master here. He has a few notable moves, right? He can roll around, and that can do some decent damage and just sometimes be a little difficult to keep up with when he starts going in circles. He likes to slam his massive chin on the ground quite a bit, which can hurt a lot, but mostly causes tremors, especially when he pulls his head back for a long time and just bam, lands that thing. But it's not damage that really ever bothers me when it comes to Uragaan. Mostly it's how he moves. Every time he slams down his chin, he's gonna either interrupt your movement or the way he pivots around makes him a little bit more difficult to try to keep up with, at least for me. And this isn't hard, it's just, yes, you do have to be careful not to hit his giant chin, as that puts you at risk of having your weapon deflected, which is never fun. But for the most part, you don't have to worry about where you hit with the monster, just if you can hit him. There are times when he does this massive tail sweep, and that will send out some stones, which theoretically will explode if he ever hits them or causes tremors near him. But for whatever reason, because they're just so small, I think, they never really become an issue in the hunt. Staying close to the Uragaan can also present some interesting risks. For example, it likes to shoot out different gases. Some of these flaming gases, which will do damage, and another one being a sleep gas, which of course will leave you vulnerable to being put to sleep if you don't have the right resistances or items. The thing I don't like the most when it comes to 3U's Uragaan, however, is when the monster is tired. He'll go over to a certain area where there's this kind of like giant volcanic hill and rest up there. And for whatever reason, this is a hill your hunter is not able to reach, so you just kind of have to wait till Uragaan wakes up or notices you're around for it to come down for you to do some damage. That's really annoying. So Uragaan is certainly a hefty, unique looking monster that has a distinct play style. It's just a hunt I don't really enjoy that much. Okay, so I know in the Royal Ludroth segment, I had said that there were 3 aquatic monsters in low rank. I forgot about this one, and it's because I almost never hunt Ceadeus. I hate this monster. If we want to talk about the absolute worst hunt in the game, for me it's Ceadeus. Though the Gen Moren in high rank is also one of my least favorite hunts. Siege monsters almost never appeal to me. Sure, some of them have cool designs, and to be fair, Ceadeus is a cool looking monster. I definitely get this feeling of an ancient abyssal legendary creature when I hunt it. But man, Ceadeus is just such a crappy hunt. The first issue is it's all underwater. I don't hate underwater combat, but it is still clunky, and one of the bigger issues for me when it comes to underwater combat is sometimes perspective. It's not always easy to identify how close or far you are from a monster, and sometimes you're gonna whiff attacks that look like you should have made contact. This happened to me a lot when hunting Ceadeus. Sure, you also have to keep an eye on your oxygen supply, but if you wear the right armor set, mostly the Royal Ludroth one, then you won't have to, or if you bring certain items, it's not that big of a deal. It's just a minor nuisance. The other thing I just don't enjoy about Ceadeus is that it's just really long of a hunt. You're doing just a bunch of chip damage, and it doesn't feel like you're making much progress. On top of that, you have to follow the monster through these different sections depending on what hunt you're doing. Yes, you can hunt this monster where it's going through the tunnel and you need to do a certain damage threshold before you can enter it in its special location. And then you might not even kill the monster, but just do, hopefully, enough damage to repel it, which is never fun because it feels like a whole half hour that just kinda got wasted. Yes, you did technically make progress and you will be able to go back and hunt the Ceadeus and potentially kill it on your second go through, but it's just never an entertaining hunt for me. What keeps Ceadeus from being super hard though is that it really isn't going to be attacking you a lot. Yeah, simply by swimming it has a chance of hitting you and doing good damage, but its actual attacks are incredibly slow, very predictable, and very few. So Ceadeus isn't hard, it's just a long, tedious, and monotonous hunt. By far the worst, and I do not plan on hunting this monster ever again. Alright, back to a monster I actually really love. Seriously, Barioth, one of the best ice monsters, absolutely cool. Can't quite say if it's my absolute favorite, because Lagiacrus is a monster I really like, but we'll get to that when we get to that. First off, I kinda wanna apologize for the quality of footage here, mostly in terms of the fact that I'm not the best with hunting horn, and even though I know Barioth well enough, I did not hunt it the best with this weapon. So, I look pretty crappy because I'm doing a pretty crappy job. I apologize. Barioth, however, I think is a really well-balanced hunt. There are only a few things that kind of can be tricky. Because it has the body type of that of a Tigrex or a Nargacuga, you can expect Barioth to be rather fast, and it is. It's quite mobile. This to me is actually really effective and cool, and it keeps the hunt more dynamic, and it uses its moves in some very fun and unique ways. It pounces around a lot, it doesn't stay in the air too often, or isn't too hard to hit when it is in the air. It can shoot off these like ice breath kind of tornado things that are neat. It'll sometimes even bounce off walls, and one of its honestly kind of harder moves to dodge would be its large tail swipe. That tail is quite huge and covers quite a bit of the monster. If you're on the right side, you don't have to worry about it, but it's an effective move. What keeps Barioth a challenge is just how aggressive the monster is. It's constantly fighting you. It treats you as an actual threat, and that keeps the hunt a lot more dynamic, which is fun, and it doesn't hurt that the monster looks cool and gives off cool armor and weapons. But the thing that took the longest for me to get used to when it came to hunting Barioth is its shoulder check. For whatever reason, that move is the #1 move that gets me. I don't think it's too hard to dodge the tornado, and again, when it's in the air, it can do this mega swipe move, but really, a well-positioned Superman dive is your #1 way to dodge any type of mega move, and it's no harder to read with Barioth either. You can certainly be immobilized, or at least unable to attack for a while when you're put in the frost ice cube thing when it does its ice breath, so having resistances or items for that is certainly useful and important, but I think it's because of just how much range that shoulder check is. Like, it's basically the whole side of the monster's body. It's a little bit harder to dodge. Not necessarily hard to predict, you can tell when the monster's gonna do it, but it's a fast movement, so chances are you may already be in the middle of a combo, and it's just gonna get you anyway. I would say the speed and higher aggression of the monsters what puts it up this high. Barioth, awesome monster, awesome hunt. I look forward to it every time it returns, and I cannot wait for it in Rise. Back to the aquatic monsters, we have the frogfish himself, Gobul. Gobul is one of those monsters that I do find to be a bit more challenging when hunting underwater, mostly because it's quite fast, and because it puffs its body up, it has a lot of range, especially when rolling around. When it tries to suck you into its mouth and jump out of the water, I think is its easiest time to dodge, otherwise it can be difficult to hit the monster. A lot of this is due to the fact that when it's inflated, those spikes add up some good resistance to your weapons. On land, however, Gobul isn't nearly as difficult. It's more balanced, not too easy, but also not too hard. What keeps Gobul so high, however, is a combination of both frustrating underwater combat at times, and a mixture of Volvidon-like status inflictions. You might think it's okay to try go behind the Gobul and attack it back there, going for the tail instead, as a way to avoid its puffed up body. Unfortunately, that tail just takes one swipe and you're paralyzed. Not very fun. On top of that, Gobul will also flash its lantern, which unless you have some type of guard weapon, or I believe Superman diving, is gonna get you, otherwise there's no other protection from it. Which of course also leaves you stunned and open for attacks. It's all these combinations of how Gobul can also go under the ground and just be away from you for a while, how it charges at you a lot and puffing up, rolling around. This monster just moves a lot, does a fair amount of stacked damage, can inflict you with multiple status elements, and it can even sometimes just resist your weapons by bouncing them off from its spikes. It's a challenge, and it can be a bit obnoxious at times. I don't hate the monster, but I get why people don't enjoy the hunt that much. So if you ever needed a really good reason to get yourself some great Wroggi armor, Gigginox is that reason. A notorious creepy worm-like monster, Gigginox can put even Rathian to shame with just how toxic it gets. It spits poison, it causes poisonous gas fumes, it can even lay eggs of poison. This thing is venomous to a T. Honestly though, I really love Gigginox. The hunt in of itself isn't the worst. Gigginox movements are a bit sporadic at times, it jumps around a lot, it can really extend its neck, and that can get annoying, as it has a good chance of tripping you up and hitting you from distances you didn't realize. It will hang from the ceiling, which in 3U is not the easiest to deal with. And on top of that, depending on whether or not it's in enraged state, some parts of its body are actually incredibly resistant to weapons, causing them to bounce off a lot. When in its normal state, its head is most vulnerable, which is kind of a sick joke, as it's also from its head when it likes to bite at you the most. It charges, it also just slams its body down. While that's certainly vulnerable, it also leaves you vulnerable to some of its more deadly attacks. When enraged though, not only does Gigginox look incredibly badass, or more so, It switches where the tail becomes attackable and the head more resistant. In plenty of cases, certain moves do leave the Gigginox fairly vulnerable. Attacking the wings is going to be your most effective bet, simply because they don't tend to bounce anything off. And when Gigginox slams its body down on the ground, it leaves itself incredibly open. It's all the poison attacks that I think kind of drive this hunt to a bit over the edge for certain people. It's a lot like the Great Wroggi, where it's poison, it's very gaseous and tends to stay in an area and ends up being practically an environmental obstacle within the fight itself. Not only will it lay toxic egg sacs, it also lays basic egg sacs, which cause other little Giggis to come out who can just be a little intrusive. The move that took me the longest to kind of learn would be when Gigginox sets up its gas fumes from under its belly. Sure, this move has quite the wind-up, but it can catch you off guard. On top of that, it lasts a fairly long time, and it can be hard to predict when you can go back in to land some hits again, because the monster is pretty vulnerable when it does this. Having a poison immunity-based armor set is going to make this hunt drastically easier, and it's why I ended up liking the Great Wroggi set so much. However, I still really like Gigginox and think it's an awesome monster and a genuinely fun, challenging hunt. In fact, Gigginox armor is my favorite armor from 3U. So yeah, I'd love to see this monster come back, and I think despite how obnoxious the poisoning can be, I still get a kick out of hunting this monster. So Duramboros is a lot like Ceadeus. It's a large monster where it just has so much bulk that feels like it takes forever to hunt. The big differences are that A, Duramboros is on land, B, Duramboros is a cooler looking monster that has much more threatening attacks, and C, I actually like Duramboros. Yeah, despite the fact that the hunt can go on for longer than I'd like at times, I still think Duramboros is really neat, especially in its design, its armor, and it just has really cool weapons. The hunt in of itself is really unique. This herbivorous brute wyvern walking mountain has a lot more mobility, momentum, and airtime than you'd expect this monster to have. As expected, with its bull-like horns, Duramboros will do some charging. However, charging is really the easiest thing to dodge from the monster. It will also have moments where it swings its head back and forth, raking up the ground with its horns, and its hammer-like tail is something to keep in note, as it can hurt quite a bit, and it can swing it around a lot, and slam it in the ground. However, positioning yourself under Duramboros is your most effective way to dodge almost every hit of it. The only way Duramboros counters this is that it likes to move around a bit. The big thing when it comes to this monster is when it starts swinging its tail around in a giant circle. There are a few things that can happen. For one, it may use the momentum it gains by swinging its tail to just pivot the monster around or reposition it somewhere else on the map. Another thing that happens is that the monster might go flying up in the air afterwards, and eventually come landing back down. At first, this is going to take a little time to predict where the monster will land, and which end will land which way. Because depending on what you're using, or what you're wanting to get out of the monster, you might want to try to go for the tail, or you might want to try to go for the horns. Either way, this can do a lot of damage, and during the swinging of its tail, you can get hit and thrown back quite a distance. And maybe it's just me, but when getting hit during this move seems to sometimes dictate whether or not the monster is going to then go up in the air. There are also moments when the monster trips over, usually due to a longer hunt, exhaustion, or some damaged parts. This is your most opportune time to go for its actual weak spot, its back. If you can do enough damage to the back, you break it and open up this tiny volcanic core in its back. It's really interesting. And there you'll do the most damage if you hit it. Despite the risk when it comes to hunting Duramboros, as it picks up a lot of speed when swinging that tail, I actually find it fun trying to get under the monster during this moment, as if you can hit the monster's feet enough, you actually trip it up, giving yourself prime opportunity to go for the back. It's a fun hunt, and Duramboros is cool, and it offers a good challenge. Moving on, number 4, we have Agnaktor, the Flaming Leviathan. Now, for me, when it comes to 3rd generation monsters, it's always a toss-up between Agnaktor and Lagiacrus of which one I like more. Agnaktor's just such a cool design, it has this unique beak, and its hunt is rather distinct. Similar to other Leviathans, you'll find Agnaktor sliding around on its belly quite often as a way to come charging at you. Instead of swimming through water, Agnaktor can swim through the ground and lava. In fact, in one attack it does this kind of cool shark-like thing where its fin comes chasing after you. It will also sometimes burrow and do this corkscrew thing where it goes in and out from the ground to the roof of the cave, which is certainly interesting. Most of its attacks, I would say, are fairly predictable and can be blocked or dodged quite easily. Admittedly, when the Agnaktor is sliding around on its belly, it is a lot quicker to pivot and turn towards the hunter, so you really have to predict where the monster is heading versus where it is in its current state. One of my favorite things about Agnaktor is that when it comes up halfway, it does this whole laser beam attack that can encircle around, or sometimes you'll just do a laser beam when standing around, and you can identify this by a sound. The Agnaktor has this beak-like snout, and it will clack it a few times before emitting its laser beam. It's really neat, a nice little attention to detail to the creature. The part that makes Agnaktor difficult is really how its body functions. Agnaktor in of itself has kind of like this magma-like shell over its skin. When it's not in the lava or hasn't been immersed in lava recently, this shell will be cooled and hardened, making it a lot tougher to penetrate and will bounce attacks quite frequently. Because of this, you have to wait until Agnaktor either swims in some lava or buries itself underground and comes back up, where then the shell shall be a lot softer and you'll be able to do some significant damage to it. By breaking these different parts of the shell on its body, you can continuously do damage to them even when it's hardened. Agnaktor may be a bit of a slippery monster that sometimes you have to wait before you can do some proper damage to, but is otherwise to me a very engaging and fun hunt. Here we are to the mascot of the series himself, Rathalos. Now Rathalos has a really cool design, it has badass armor that's really useful, some distinct and memorable weapons, and is genuinely a cool monster. But boy do I not enjoy its hunt in 3U. Sticking true to its title, the King of the Skies, Rathalos likes to spend a lot of time in the air. And the best way to counter this, if you aren't a gun user, would be with flash bombs. There are moments when Rathalos will stay close enough to the ground like a Rathian where you can hit its tail to at least do some damage, but otherwise this monster is usually too high up to reach, which is rather annoying. That's really the biggest factor here. If it wasn't for how often Rathalos stays in the air, I think it'd be a lot more entertaining of a hunt and one I'd find much less obnoxious. When on ground, it's a lot more easier to deal with. It has similar moves to that of Rathian. It'll swing its tail around, it'll charge at you, shoot some fireballs. In the air, it'll do this swooping move from time to time, which seems to do absolutely nothing. It'll shoot down some fireballs in multiple sessions. And most of all, the biggest thing you have to look out for is when it comes at you with its talons. They seem to hone in on the hunter, and when they hit you, they do a pretty good amount of damage and can also poison, which is a frustrating status to deal with in this particular hunt at times. The safest spot for me when it comes to hunting Rathalos, however, is not the head. If you're gonna be by the head, you gotta be somewhere close under its neck or its chest, but preferably be behind those legs. The reason for this is because Rathalos will like to do a roar, and after it does its roar, it then pushes itself up into the air with its wings, and upon doing so, it shoots a fire blast right where it was standing, typically where its head was at. And this fireball does a ton of damage. So through a combination of sometimes being hard to hit, doing a lot of damage, and being able to inflict some annoying status elements, Rathalos is definitely one of the tougher hunts in the game. I know I said that I have a hard time choosing between Lagiacrus and Agnaktor, and in terms of design, yeah, Lagiacrus is also a badass looking monster. It's super cool, I love its color scheme, I like that it's a Leviathan, it's just a really neat monster. But in terms of the hunt, I don't particularly enjoy 3U's version of Lagiacrus. This is our final aquatic monster for the list, and yeah, it's the most difficult, and yes, the underwater combat is where I tend to find the monster the most challenging. So let's first talk about what it's like on land. On land, Lagiacrus is a lot more balanced. Without being too easy, it is still pretty mobile, it'll slide around, it has a few thunder-based attacks, and it likes to swing its tail around. A very manageable hunt without being too obnoxious, and nothing major to deal with when it comes to the monster because it doesn't have any super move during this state. Underwater, however, even when not fully charged, and we'll get to that, Lagiacrus is a much more challenging foe, and it makes sense. Lagiacrus already looks like a giant alligator-like creature that can swim through the water with ease, and as such, it can, meaning it's incredibly mobile, and it moves around quite a bit. This can make it difficult to keep up with and even hit depending on what weapon you're using. Not to mention, a lot of Lagiacrus's moves involve movement, swinging its head around, doing these dive bite attacks at you. and even using its tail as like a paddle to hit you up from below. What makes Lagiacrus the most deadly to me underwater is when it's fully charged. You'll notice this when its crystal-like structures on its back are emitting a bunch of electricity. Yes, the Lagiacrus will shoot off these little electrical orbs from time to time and can summon some small little electrical bursts. These attacks, while annoying and can stack up with stun damage because they can inflict you with electric blight, and no one enjoys stun, it can be annoying. But for me, the worst move is when Lagiacrus lets out its full discharge, surrounding its whole body with these electrical bursts. The problem isn't really the move. There's a decent enough tell, though it is rather quick, and I get it. It makes sense why Lagiacrus would emit such an attack. My only issue is the effect animation for the lightning. Maybe I'm a little too used to how it works in some of the later games, but it's rather difficult for me to identify where I should avoid when it comes to using this move. Because there are some safety zones, it isn't a full area effect move. Judging where the safety zones are isn't always the easiest though. On top of that, it's just been some personal issues when hunting this monster in the past, or when I first hunted it in 3U, that make me not enjoy the hunt and definitely find it to be a reasonable challenge. For example, when trying to make its equipment, you're going to need a lot of horns, and the horns don't drop at a very consistent rate, and the monster likes to move its head quite a bit. So breaking the horns isn't always the most entertaining thing to do. Lagiacrus, you're a very, very cool monster, but in 3U, your hunt is also a bit annoying. And the champion for being the #1 hardest monster to me in 3U's low rank is Diablos. Admittedly, when I first ever hunted this monster in 3U, I hated it. I've grown to really like Diablos as time goes on, and I've gotten more familiar with the hunt, even in 3U. But due to the restrictions I gave myself for recording footage for this hunt and ranking the monsters, came back up as being super difficult again. Here's the #1 way to cheese Diablos when it's not super enraged, and we'll get to that. Bring sonic bombs. When the monster goes underground and you throw sonic bombs, it helps keep him stuck underground. Only the upper half of his body comes out, and it gives you free chances to hit and wail on his head. It's really satisfying, because unlike most of the monsters, I would say that Diablos does a really good job at covering its openings after attacking. The most notable one for me that consistently messed me up would be that after Diablos gave a long charge, I tried hitting it from behind, but lo and behold, Diablos uses its massive battle axe-like club tail to just swing all around, and it hits you like almost 360. If you aren't in front of it, you're gonna get hit. Because of this, it encourages a lot more patience when dealing with the monster. And that can be rather frustrating because Diablos does not give a lot of openings. Incredibly tired or maybe eating will you get the most prime opportunity to hit it. Otherwise, you need to go in and make some quick hits or chip damage before it just starts attacking again, because Diablos is just relentless. On one hand, that's really fun. It keeps the hunt very engaging. It's a bull-like creature, so it needs to be consistently aggressive. But on the other hand, you don't get a whole lot of perfect opportunity moments like you do with some of the other monsters, such as Duramboros or even Agnaktor. Knocking over the monster is incredibly satisfying when you finally do it, and breaking its horns or breaking off its tail is also satisfying, because those areas can be rather difficult to hit. Now, I did mention that Diablos is still difficult to deal with when it gets enraged, and that's because it becomes much faster. Typically when Diablos goes underground, it'll then re-emerge, trying to get you out from underneath, and it's a pretty hefty damage dealing move, and it throws you just everywhere. But when enraged, you get mere seconds to try to avoid this move. You can with dodge rolling, but Superman diving, or if you're a Lancer, guard that shit. This also means that the window of opportunity to hit it with a sonic bomb is much smaller when it's enraged. Oh yeah, and speaking of damage, all of Diablos' moves do a lot of damage. They stack quite nicely, and it'll consistently hit you, because it never stops. I know that I didn't mention this with Gigginox, because it does have a rather loud and obnoxious scream, and that really stops you from moving, but Diablos for me has by far the most notable one. It is an absolute screech, and it will do this rather frequently at times. So there you go, that's my most difficult monster in 3U's low rank, it's Diablos. I still think it's kind of a tough monster to deal with, but I've enjoyed the hunt more as time goes on, and honestly, as the series continues, I enjoy the monster more and more for the slight little tweaks they give it, but we'll talk about that when we get to, like, World, and hopefully Rise. I hope it's going to be in Rise's low rank, and I can't wait to see what new attacks they gave it or how different the hunt is going to be with the new mechanics in that game. So there we go, you guys let me know what you think are some of the more tougher monsters in 3U, what you thought on my list. Give me some feedback on what are the ideas you kind of like when it comes to these. Should I stick with the rule set that I gave in this one? And I'll see you guys maybe next time with some more Monster Hunter armor equipment, or maybe I'll do some mashups of just some fun hunts, or perhaps I'll even just do some footage of me taking on monsters and talking about them in the respective games. See you guys next time, and enjoy your day.